when we mention these cases, the latest I heard is that the present Minister of Defense, Zahid, has said that our campaign to take this case to the French courts is a smear campaign against the government. A smear campaign. We are doing this in the most honorable way, is to bring it to the French courts. There is no smear campaign. Any smear campaign has been committed by the government. Detaining and deporting Monsieur Boudon is the biggest smear campaign against Malaysia. And the government also says people like us want the arms spending to decrease so that Singapore can increase its arms spending. So you see, we are looking at defense policy. When we look at a country's defense policy, you would think that the country would first think, who are our enemies? From what the government seems to be saying, our enemy seems to be Singapore. Our enemy cannot be the United States, can it? The United States is the country that spends the most on arms in the world. 600 billion US a year. Something like 5% of its GDP, and that is why the United States is now imploding. The biggest crisis facing the American government today is getting its budget through Congress. But in my book on page 10, you will see the Prime Minister Najib Razak speaking at the US Heritage Fund, in which he says to the American audience, to the American armed forces chiefs, that the relationship between the Malaysian government and the US government is a very well kept secret. And he talks about how Malaysia has been allowing its airspace and its facilities for US armed forces and the US naval fleet, and so on and so forth. And don't mind Dr. Mahathir. He's always posturing, and we know that the relationship between Malaysia and the US are on the strongest footing. This is what the Prime Minister says in front of his US audience. But today, what do we have? A smear campaign against Pakatan Rakyat by saying that they are the stooges of the US and so forth. Today, Britain and France and Russia and China are not seen as the enemies of Malaysia. This is in the eyes of the Malaysian government. And you think that the best of friends of Malaysia would be ASEAN, would you? Because ASEAN is trying its hardest to have an integrated union like the European Union. We're trying our best to have an ASEAN Human Rights Charter, which is like the first steps that the European Union took when they had a European Human Rights Commission and a European Human Rights Court. Today, because of the scarcity of resources, Britain is forced to share their arms resources with France. If you know the history of the Anglo-French rivalry, today in the car we were just talking about how the English hate the French, etc. If you read the history of the British Empire and the French Empire, you understand how bitter enemies they were. Today they are sharing 2 aircraft carriers. They are forced to pool resources, but these poor, faded colonial empires, they can afford 2 aircraft carriers, but they cannot afford fighter jets for the aircraft carriers. Today, Denmark has decided they can do without submarines. Today, The Netherlands, you remember reading our Malay history and reading about how the Dutch conquered, took over Malacca from the Portuguese. The Dutch cannot afford maritime reconnaissance. This is the reality of today's world. This is the reality in which we are faced. When the government tells you the government cannot afford food subsidies for you, or the poor, you know, we're very concerned about the poor. The whole new economic policy is about the poor. But we cannot afford 700 million. On the same week, I said in my book, on the same week when the government was saying they cannot pay 700 million food subsidies, the government was buying 10 billion worth of arms in the KL Arms Fair. 10 billion. When everybody in the newspapers is shouting, getting very hot, hardly anybody noticed that the government is buying 10 billion worth of arms. Even more recently, the government said they're going to buy 700 million worth of guns. The same amount as the food subsidies. And it goes on. So what I'm saying is that yes, in ASEAN, we need to have an ASEAN, we need to pool resources in ASEAN. It is a very strong admission if we say that our enemy is Singapore. And what I argued in my book, and what I also hope that Malaysians will start to think, is that we have an alternative defense policy, a defensive defense policy. When I was in secondary school, I watched the Vietnamese defeat the strongest country in the world, the United States. The United States was pounding Vietnam and North Vietnam with their most sophisticated fighter jets and bombs and B-52s. And what did the Vietnamese have? They had the guerrilla war, they had the militias, etc. So let's assume, even if the United States attacked Malaysia, never mind Singapore, we will have to have a defense policy that is defensive. I don't think we can match the United States AWACS or the United States drones or the United States fighter jets. And that is to have eminently, I agree that we perhaps need anti-aircraft guns to fire at the, just as the Viet Cong had anti-aircraft guns to fire at the United States aeroplanes. But we need, that is eminently cheaper, less expensive than to buy the best fighter jets or to buy submarines. And if it goes to my book, we will also find that what is 2 submarines at 7.5 billion? When our defense experts think that we need 10 submarines because Malaysia has got a very big maritime border. So that's the fact. If you really want submarines, 2 submarines is not enough. Okay? And I also looked at how we bought what we thought was the most sophisticated Hornets. But 3 months after our Hornets were delivered, our defense minister asked the visiting US defense deputy minister, said, please give us the most sophisticated arms for our Hornets. Meaning that 3 months after we bought our Hornets, they were not the most advanced. If Singapore has the most advanced Hornets, then in the moment our Hornets get in the air, they'll be shot down. And so on and so forth. I think there are too many of these cases to think about. You know? I've always mentioned this case of a whole warship, the Indrapura, being burned. That's millions burned without many people knowing about it. And much more.